So with the next Warhammer 40k balance update largely expected to turn up within the month, which armies and units might most need or deserve nerfs or buffs? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk about the state of the game in Warhammer 40k and expectations for the next balance pass. As I'm sure most people are pretty familiar with at this point, Games Workshop's balance updates tend to come in quarters these days, and given that the last one happened around the 13th of September, that's to put the next one up round about mid-December. This is the same as they did last year. Last year they decided to move their usual balance update from sort of early to mid-January to mid-December, and that did seem like a fairly reasonable move going forward. It fits in a bit better with their edition release cycles, and maybe gives people things to experiment and talk about with games over the usually slightly quieter Christmas period. Their calendar can be a bit flexible, though it usually tends to come out on Wednesdays, unless it winds up leaking out early as it did on the Warhammer app on the 13th. For the usual content to their balance updates, they usually tend to be points updates, rules changes via the balance Dataslate to units and things that are better addressed via rules than points, and maybe some new detachments, which they did promise more of this time around, though it seems that as we're already getting some with the whole 500 worlds thing, I don't know how many they'd issue as a digital update. Aside from normal balance things, there could well be something unusual with this one. I feel like there's higher chance than most. We do already know we're getting the unusual rules updates of these 500 World Campaigns books. The first one, called Titus, will have some new models coming alongside, the Necron new special character, the new Nightbringer, and Titus's command squad. And also in those books we're getting a bunch of new detachments as well. The first has 3 for Space Marines and Necrons. There's a pretty good chance they make some interesting impacts on the armies that get them, unless they manage to really underbake all of the rules. It seems that Space Marines and Necrons are probably just the start of that, so that should be some interesting content, though I suspect that given they haven't announced any further books yet, they're probably going to come out pretty significantly after any balance update that they issue. For the digital update though, alongside the 500 Worlds campaign, they might do something unusual. In 9th edition they had really quite a major rewrite and changed the whole structure of selecting armies for 40k, with their changing of the detachment system into the Great Big Master Arcs of Omen detachment, which looked like it was also aiming to be a sort of stepping stone between 9th edition and 10th edition in its own way. We might get something more major, and Games Workshop trying to actually change up the formula rather than just make the incremental improvements they've typically been focused on so far. And last year we had all the Grotmus detachments coming out as well, rules content for every faction in the game. They might do similar again, though I feel like if they did there probably wouldn't be quite the same amount of excitement this time around. A fair few of the detachments were interesting, though some were really hit or miss. It feels like that might be a bit surplus to requirements if we were already getting lots of new detachments in the 500 world books. I really wouldn't be too surprised if they maybe just keep it a bit more targeted, have some new digital detachments drop with the balance update, ones that maybe aren't getting updates in the 500 worlds, but some sort of extra big rules drop definitely seems like a possibility. I'll not really speculate too much on that, as it really just depends on what Games Workshop feels like doing. And for this one, focus more on factions that might be more likely to get buffs and nerfs, and a few more wishlist things. For top-end game balance in Warhammer 40k, it's really not too bad right now, at least relative to the vast majority of 40k's past. As ever, there's certainly winners and losers, but the top factions in the game tend to be around about the 55% win rate mark, and the bottom ones mostly around about 45 or so. For almost the entirety of 40k's history, the top factions have done better than that, and the top factions have done worse. While things can literally always be better no matter how balanced they get, it is worth some credit that literally every faction can be interesting and powerful at a competitive level, and the ones at the top of the power tree aren't dominant to a ridiculous extent. The only real big exception to that are the Imperial Agents, though it seems that Games Workshop just aren't really intending them to be a competitive faction like the rest, unfortunately. Focusing on the upper and lower end of that spectrum, the weaker armies by the win rate numbers are the Astra Militarum, Emperor's Children, and Imperial Knights now. Definitely not unplayable, and only being around about 5% below being perfectly balanced. And of course Imperial Agents being a bit lower than that. While they can all be strong in their own way, they might still be in a position to attract more game balance attention from Games Workshop than the majority of factions. Focusing on those specifically, the Imperial Knights have win rates around 45% at this point, having dropped off a cliff from the around 60% or so that they were pre-Codex. Both points nerfs and the slightly weaker detachments in the Codex seem to have accounted for that, and perhaps compared with just about every other faction in the game. They may be one of the very worst performing ones for the top levels of tournament play. Knights usually don't tend to do quite as well there in the first place, so having quite low win rates even in casual games is kind of telling, putting them at even less chance of doing well at high levels of play with optimised lists and players who know how to use them. When the Knight Codex came out, I think partly due to people having quite so fresh memory of them being dominant, they were very apprehensive as to the Valastrite Lance and its stratagems, potentially with some big knightly rush and heavy firepower. As a result, Games Workshop dropped some day one nerfs to that. Admittedly, the stratagems were kind of bonkers. but the changes were to the point where they seem to have flipped that detachment from being potentially the strongest to perhaps being behind spearhead at arms and quest or his companions. I was just a bit sceptical as to how powerful that nightly rush really was going to be in practice as well. Certainly powerful against the right army, but for several armies, unless you could kill everything, putting big knights on the front line just doesn't tend to be the best thing that you want to do, and could be a recipe for losing lots of points very quickly in return. In any case, for whatever reason between their datasheets and the detachments, they are seeming on the underpowered side by the stats at the moment, not by a crazy extent. Feels like the most obvious thing to do would just be some points adjustments, maybe just the majority of their knight chassis dropping by a little bit in cost. It wouldn't need to be enormous, I don't think, and perhaps if you're looking for knights to give outsized buffs to, the Knight Valiant would be quite a nice choice, which has been pretty bad throughout most of 10th. If looking into the Forge World ones, then the Acheron would be a good one too. You could change rules around in some way, though my instincts will be points first here. Before we move on to the other factions that are struggling a little bit more than most, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor and Tabletop Stronghold. They're one option for transporting 40k miniatures about, and their magnetic carry cases are on a big sale at the moment for Black Friday. Magnetic storage is currently the most popular way to get Warhammer miniatures from A to B, the idea being to attach magnets to the bases of your miniatures and then put them on metal trays so they don't move about, and that means that you can put lots and lots of figures all in one tight space without them rattling around or needing bulky insulating foam. Their particular solution to these are the mag cases, made of really quite sturdy MDF, and that makes a box that's really quite notably hard to break or damage. Inside the box go different layers of steel trays that you can raise or lower depending on the height of the miniatures that you're transporting, and on the front goes a clear acrylic sheet to protect the miniatures and keep them safe. Broadly speaking, reviews of their boxes have been pretty popular. They also have a competitive terrain set as well. These are a little cheaper if you're buying a mag case. And check them out, link down in the video description if you'd like to take a look at them while their sale's on. I'll also cycle back to them briefly at the end of the video as well to talk through some of their specific boxes. Thanks to them for sponsoring this one. Moving on, next up we have the Astra Militarum, maybe in a position that's kind of common for them. Low win rates around about 45% at grand tournaments. They look like they're a bit harder to win with for the average player, but also doing alright at topping tournaments, around 7 grand tournament wins depending on what's counted, and notably being used to win the Las Vegas Open with the recon element, detachment and the horde list. The balance changes they got in the last update were a little limited. Dawns both went up a little bit, but Gaunt Ghost and Lord Solar and a few others got cheaper, and currently they seem to be in a fairly similar place to how they have been before, Combined Arms being the single most popular, then Hammer of the Emperor for some tank spam, and some people experimenting with most of the rest of the detachments as well. Despite a few players doing well at some big events, feels like there's probably enough room for a few buffs for the faction. There's quite a lot of units that don't see too regular competitive play. Most of the tracked artillery units are very weak indeed. Lord Marshal Dryer's weirdly costly. Perhaps the heavy weapon teams, and particularly anything that doesn't have a mortar, and maybe some of the lesser played Rust variants such as the Demolisher or Punisher. It feels like there's room for plenty of things to go down a bit. I feel like it wouldn't be the worst thing to see Tempestus Scions being a little bit more focal as well. They're a bit more of a rarity to see an army list these days compared with what they were. Again, like the rest of the armies down here, it's not like they're in absolutely dire straits, but maybe could use a few changes for the positive as opposed to the other way round. Also low on the win rate spectrum, we have the Emperor's Children. Tournament wins were around 46% or so, and very little top tournament performance either. Just the one grand tournament win and a few relatively high placings. It seems for the average player they're just a tiny bit on the undertuned side of things, and despite a fair bit of enthusiasm for them from some top competitive players, it really doesn't seem like they're doing anything to stand out at the tops of tournaments either. The last updates did seem like broadly good changes, helping out Flawless Blades with some extra damage and boosting Fulgrim a little. It does seem to have done enough to make the Flawless Blades actually a genuine choice rather than overshadowed. Fulgrim still less so, and they really don't have too much variation in how they're played. Generally kosher of the conceited and not really having too many choices within their small unit pool. Between all that, I feel like they're in a position where they could do with a bit of help. Perhaps rules boosts to some of the weaker detachments could be a pretty reasonable one, seeing as detachment balance is pretty bad right now. Fulgrim again doesn't really feel quite where he needs to be a strong competitive choice, like they've done with some of the Loyalist Primarchs. Might be nice more to give him rules boosts than more points cuts though. Or otherwise they could do some small points buffs to some staple units. Lucius the Eternal does seem to be getting left behind by the majority of players now, so he could be a candidate to go down there. Or perhaps aid a few of the lesser played generic units, perhaps their Sorcerer for example. Like the Guard again doesn't really feel like they're massively behind the power spectrum, even for the average players, but perhaps still in the position where they could do with a few small positive nudges as opposed to the other way around. Really the only faction that is a bit of a fail in terms of balance at the moment as ever is Imperial Agents though. Tournament win rates tend to be a bit meaningless for them, given that they're near enough unplayed in any sort of competitive capacity. Over the long term since their codex came out, they tend to be around about the sort of 40% kind of mark, though any given data slate could be quite reflective of just how the players that turned up with them happen to have done. They got a few Deathwatch changes in the last update, both getting the new Primaris kill team, plus a cheaper Veterans data sheet on Watchmaster, though it didn't really feel like those changes were aimed at them more than Deathwatch themselves. And so far Games Workshop don't really seem to have shown any interest in actually making them a balanced faction with the rest of the codexes out there, despite not really communicating that they'd be treated differently when they first put the codex on sale. When they see competitive play, it's usually with their Imperialist fleet detachment, with its movement shenanigans and help with board control. As an overall army, it feels like their main issue at the moment is they just don't really have an effective way to efficiently handle, say, big units of Terminators or monsters and vehicles, just due to the nature of their army and the options that they have. Most of their units don't tend to be things with big guns, and also perhaps to double down on that, so they don't have a core faction rule, which could be a good way to add a bit of damage in some way, perhaps something handing out some lethal hits or +1 to wound or something. I feel like inquisitorial things have had some fun orbital strike mechanics in the past. That could be another option maybe. As usual, seems unlikely they're going to get any sort of help at this stage, but I'm sure if they did do it would please the people who are trying to make the army work, and doesn't exactly feel like the hardest thing to do to throw them a bone or two with an army-wide special rule. Those are perhaps the armies with the lowest win rate at the moment, though there are a few others that aren't so far away. Drukhari and Space Wolves seem to be around about the 47%-ish, depending on which sources you look at. And then maybe also on the sort of lower mid sort of spectrum, there's Thousand Suns, Chaos Marines, Orcs, Blood Angels, and the Space Marines that aren't either Ultramarines or Raven Guard. And if you're balancing by top tournament performance, Custodians generally have okay win rates, but sort of very low success at a top tournament level. Overall for these ones, I'd probably hope that they wouldn't get nerfs more than buffs, probably the other way around if anything. Both quite fine faction balance, and these guys being relatively close to the mid-tier. I would be surprised if Games Workshop did anything major for the positive for them. It feels like it wouldn't be a terrible thing to scatter a few small points cuts for say Space Wolves or Drukhari perhaps particularly for certain units that are overshadowed. Maybe Grey Hunters would be a good example for the Space Wolves. It is kind of interesting to see the Thousand Suns still doing at least relatively well despite the doom and gloom around the faction. They copped some pretty serious nerfs last time around, but it still seems that players have been adapting rather well to them, win rates overall around about 48%, and then the Rubrique Phalanx seems to have taken over as the main competitive detachment, and that seems to be posting win rates in the 50s in grand tournaments. I certainly guess any changes for the positive for them would be very light touch. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got the armies that are looking rather stronger by the numbers. At the top end of the win rate spectrum at the moment, we've got the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Sisters of Battle, and the Aeldari. All those have been doing pretty excellently, both in terms of winning games and also winning big tournaments as well. Perhaps hiding a bit in the middle in the win rates are the Space Marines, where they have certain builds that are just far stronger than others. In particular, it looks like the Shadowmark Talon has had 60% win rates or so since the balance pass, definitely fighting up there with the strongest lists out there, and Ultramarines seem to have been doing rather well. There are quite a few other armies that are pushing the upper end of the power spectrum too. Again, all of this still isn't so bad compared with 40K's past though. Having a top army being around about 56% wins is way better than we've often had. For those armies particularly performing to a high level, the Aeldari are on around 54% wins at grand tournaments, and as a popular faction with lots of people playing them, that's translated into taking home a lot of event wins as well. The last changes were pretty light touch, a couple of small nerfs to Swooping Hawks and their Corsair Void Reavers, but not really so much to the rest. It feels like if you wanted to put a few direct nerfs onto their power levels, they do have some obvious choices to hit. They are quite mono-build at a competitive level right now, usually being either Aspect Host or War Host, and then going for Aspect Warrior spam. Fugan and his big unit of Fire Dragons to jump in and out of a Wave Serpent with the stratagems, and then spam small squads of Aspects. Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders to deal with lighter infantry and jump around doing secondary objectives, and usually Lycus and Jane Zar also being big damage dealer squads as well. It feels like in first impressions probably a few small points increases to the most auto-include units seem reasonable enough, given that they are overperforming a bit relative to the rest of the field currently, and it might give just a little bit more chance of the other Aeldari units to shine through potentially. Maybe it could go hand in hand with a few buffs to other builds like say Wraith Host or Harlequins perhaps. It would be quite nice to have Aeldari not just aspect spam at a competitive level. The Sisters of Battle seem to be right up here on the numbers as well. Tournament win rates are around 55%, and again way overperforming for the amount of tournament victories compared with the rest of the armies out there, particularly stand out for a lesser played faction. Last update had a few small buffs, but in particular Retributors getting way better. They went from being a fairly bad unit to a pretty standout one. Unlike the Aeldari, they've got quite a lot more options for how they get things done. Hallowed Martyrs and Champions of Faith being the most standout competitive detachments, there looks like a fair few more people are picking up Bringers of Flame with the Retributors getting better. If they're getting any small nerfs, it would be quite nice if they could preserve that. Perhaps for auto-include staples that could take the edge off army strength and try and make them a little less auto-include. Could be some sort of bump to either Morven Val or a Paragon Warsuits. I'd probably go more Val out of the two. They get played in the vast majority of army lists currently. Maybe the Castigator being another good option, something that's basically fairly great everywhere. Or otherwise, if just wanting to take the edge off them a bit, perhaps a few scattered 5-point increases to some of the more common staples that they have. Again, doesn't really feel like they need loads here. They are perhaps a less easy faction to play than the majority. Just something to nudge them a bit more into the upper mid sort of spectrum as opposed to one of the top armies in the game. Then finally, perhaps the real standout army of the last balance patch have been the Adeptus Mechanicus. So far they've generally had the highest win rates after the balance patch, around 56% or so, and they've tended to have some of the most high placings per the play rate out of any of the factions. They did get a pretty serious buff last time around, giving Belisarius Call the Oath of Moment style rerolls amongst other stuff, and then good improvements to already strong datasheets with the Infiltrators, Iron Striders and Rust Stalkers. Current lists tend to either build around Skitarii Hunter Cohort or the Halo Screed Battleclade. They're maybe not absolutely awful for unit choice and variety, though some staples do make it into the vast majority of lists. It's almost always Belisarius Call leading the way now, and Iron Striders the preferred firepower of choice. Almost every list tends to go pretty heavy on the Sicarians and Taraxi as well, both of which can be pretty great for objectives and board control, and the Sicarians can certainly hand out the damage too. With their performance at the moment, they do seem like they're probably going to be the most likely army to be in the crosshairs for a few points nerfs. I feel like that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world for AdMech. Basically trying to make their expensive units get a little bit more points in game, I think is a good general direction for them to travel in. It does feel like some of the ones that were buffed last time are the ones that could most afford to go up a touch. Belisarius Call, the Infiltrators and the Iron Striders are all sufficiently auto-include to the point where they'd still be good units if they went up a bit. Nerfs there would quite directly affect the whole faction and might have a few more units rise up and get some more equal play with them if they did choose to increase a bit. Otherwise, for strong armies out there, I'd be kind of surprised if the Raven Guard Shadowmark Talon came through this without some kind of nerfs. It's got pretty huge win rates around the 60% kind of mark, and really quite a lot of event wins to the extent where to be competing pretty well with a lot of other factions, even just taken alone. I'm not entirely sure what they'd do to tone this down a bit. They could do some sort of rules changes to the detachment itself, though perhaps feels like the single most guaranteed thing would be Ethon Shan getting a nerf in some way. At 85 points, he's definitely in the running for the single best lone operative in the game. I'm not sure if they'll do anything else with Ultramarines at this stage either. They're also doing fairly well, and we've yet to see the impact of the new datasheets that they've got. At least on paper, the new Victrix Honor Guards are looking rather scary between their stats and their movement tricks. They'll kind of feel at this stage, if Games Workshop are lucky in the changes they're going to make, they might escape balance adjustments at the next one unless they're pretty rapid about it. Besides them, there's plenty of other armies looking the sort of upper mid-tier kind of things. Tau have been doing really well recently, though did get Delta nerf with the stealth suit rules change. They're just a bit less efficient for guiding now. I still suspect that they'll do well enough, though maybe that might avoid the need for further nerfs. Otherwise, I can't help but think that the Riptide with the Strength 10 Ion Accelerator might well be in the crosshairs. Beyond that, it maybe gets a little bit less standout for armies. Things like Necrons, Chaos Demons, World Eaters and Chaos Knights all seem to be both doing good in terms of win rates and event wins, though they really aren't too far ahead of a vast number of the other factions in the game around about the 50% wins level. Outside of just nerfing strong stuff and raising up the weaker stuff in the game, there's all manner of other things they could be doing for a bit of army balance and interest for both the extremes and also the middle tier of the game. In the past, they have made some efforts to shore up some detachments and try and improve them relative to the others. Maybe the ones that feel like they could be the highest priority will be the factions that tend to only really play one thing at a competitive level now. Good examples could be the World Eaters Berserker Warband, Chaos Knights with their Infernal Lance and the Gatling Despoilers there, Emperor's Children with the Coterie of the Conceited, Black Templars with the Gladius Task Force, and maybe Drukhari with Reaper's Wager still seems to be rather dominant. It would be quite nice to give these ones something to rival them a bit better. There's plenty of ways that you could do that. If the faction's strong, you could maybe tone down the best detachments slightly. If they're weak, then you could buff the others, or you could try and buff units that do better in detachments that revolve around a specific datasheet. Talking of Black Templars, they certainly feel like they're a divergent chapter that could do with a divergent chapter detachment that does better than the core codex. The ones that came out in their codex were rather underwhelming. All interesting enough ideas, though focusing around really quite specific datasheets to the point where they just don't really help out the core things that the Black Templars have that are strong at the moment. As a result, at a competitive level, the Gladius is the vastly most played one. It feels like the Black Templars are just missing a general purpose melee one, and you could either make changes to codex detachments or release a whole new one, or potentially buff the Grotmus detachment that they had last time around. To a lesser extent, it still feels like the Space Wolves and Dark Angels have this problem. They both at least have one themed detachment that does well, the Space Wolves Saga of the Beast Slayer and the Dark Angels Wrath of the Rock, though at least from the performance stats, it looks like Gladius and Stormlance do better for both of these, at least on the win rate metrics, and the Space Wolves seem to have had basically all their tournament success from things that aren't Codex detachments. It seems that only Blood Angels and Deathwatch at the moment have detachments that are so strong that Gladius doesn't really see a look in. Out of any of these, it does feel like the Black Templars are the highest priority here though. Then otherwise, when talking detachments, if they were to try and help out any of them, probably the ones that feel like they should be the highest priority are where there's notable playstyles or themes within an army that really revolve around one playstyle, and the detachment that's supposed to represent that just really isn't very good at the moment. The Chaos Legions feel like they should be a particularly good one to get right, with things like the Alpha Legion Deceptors, the Night Lord Dread Talons, and the Iron Warriors Fellhammer Siege Host, all being pretty underwhelming compared with the top Chaos stuff at the moment, and quite a lot of people do collect those legions specifically. I did mention Aeldari earlier briefly, but their Wraith Host would be another good thing to see improvements for, and neither Harlequins nor Inari are particularly viable as a standalone army, and again that you have people collecting those as sort of sub-factions within the main faction, they feel like they should be far higher priority to actually balance compared with the rest. Realistically, I don't think they're going to try and balance every detachment in the game. It doesn't really feel like the highest priority compared with getting other things right. I suspect there's plenty that are just bad and will remain bad. For a few other ones, maybe things like the Blood Angels Death Company one could be nice, the Tyranids Unending Swarm, maybe the Orc Dread Mob, and making their Speed War work with Buggies more. There's plenty of others that you could talk about though. Again, this one will be very faction specific, but there's plenty of units that you could potentially buff out there that I think would have really quite good feels to their individual armies. In particular, any big faction commanders or iconic units that are pretty integral to the faction would be nice to see get good. Some of the first ones that spring to mind are Angron for the World Eaters. Feels a bit tragic that he's left behind quite so much, and same for Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, who we mentioned earlier. The standard Terminator squads, perhaps particularly now they've got fancy assault Terminators out there, it would be very nice to see them suddenly get good at the end of 10th edition, after being rather underwhelming for the Space Marines for the rest. It still feels like aggressors maybe have some room for improvement as well, even if they have helped them out to the point where they're more interesting in things like Firestorm again. Otherwise for Tyranids, maybe the Tyranid Warriors would be nice. In theory, a staple battle line units that just can't really carry that sort of role currently, and the Carnifexes and Screamer Killers both feel overshadowed in terms of what they do for the points cost compared with the rest of the monsters, where you might expect them to be carrying the front line. Again, only really scratching the surface here, you could go through every single faction in the game. Another one that I feel like cycle back to a fair bit are the Necron core troop combos outside of a maximal reanimation blob with Orokin and the Warriors. Just seem to be rather thin on the ground at the moment. It might be nice to have a few more legions marching forward there. It'd probably be a bit hopeful to talk about aircraft and fortifications and trying to make them into a more mainstream part of the game again, but I think they're still worth a mention. Certain ones like Helldrakes or Guard Valkyries are really quite well enjoyed by their armies, and by deliberately keeping them pretty niche, you are relegating a bunch of core models to be rarely seen in a more competitive setting. Where I feel like if Games Workshop did put some thought to it, they could find a solution where aircraft are an option and not an auto-include, and also don't cause problems, even if they had to do something arbitrary like just have, say, no more than 2 flyers on the board, at least in their tournament settings. The same's pretty true for fortifications. It wouldn't be terrible to have at least a few more of those, at least semi-viable. Most of their points costs are bad. It does feel like quite a lot of the super heavies deliberately seem to be kept in this not so very well balanced category as well. It does feel like certain units like the Tau Storm Surge, the Khorne Lord of Skulls, the Eldar Wraith Knight and the Orc Stomper just don't generally tend to get too much interest or help. I guess we did have Games Workshop throw a few bones to the Baneblade chassis recently. Finally, on the flip side of balance, for the sort of mid-tier factions, I think there's a reasonable chance that any slightly more niche units that are absolute auto-includes that you need in every single list have at least a chance of getting touched with nerfs. I wouldn't be too surprised at all if the Chaos Knights dual Gatling Despoiler had something to make it worse in the next update. It just seems kind of badly balanced for the faction currently. Easily the strongest Chaos Knight variant by quite a wide margin with the Infernal Lance buffs that it gets, just having fairly godly firepower against all targets when you have the option to flex into lethal hits and maybe ignores cover. So probably rather than just raising points costs like they might do, feels like a better solution might be so that it doesn't have quite so much of a godly interaction with getting free lethal hits. As if you just put the points up on the Despoiler quite a bit, then it's going to affect it in all detachments, and not just that one where it's a problem. At the moment, it's just taken vastly more commonly than the vast majority of other Chaos Knights though. I could easily see a nerf for internal balance, though perhaps hopefully backed up by buffs to other things as well, as that'd be a pretty direct impact on the strength of the faction. In a similar sort of category, I could easily see them increasing the cost of the Black Templar Repulsor Executioner, the one that basically gets a free multi-melter and free rerolls against things that are near your own units. It just feels like the exact sort of unit that's maybe a slightly oddball datasheet that has become a bit of a staple in the Templar lists, and due to having awesome rules, it's just the go-to firepower choice for them by a wide margin, pretty well flat better than the other Space Marine firepower choices it rivals with, and I'd guess it might go up in cost as a result. In any case, it will certainly be interesting to see what the Dataslate brings when we eventually get it. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. What do you think that Warhammer 40k needs at the moment, and what will be your hopes and fears for your faction? That's about it for this one though. Before I go, I'll just cycle back briefly to Tabletop Stronghold, the video sponsor. As mentioned, makers of magnetic carry cases based in the USA, and they have their big Black Friday sale on at the moment. Here are the numbers of miniatures that can fit on their trays when maximally loaded, around about 90 odd 25mm bases or 30 odd Terminators. And then those steel trays go inside boxes of different sizes and heights. This one's the smallest one with the Mag Case Mini, £58 or $65 while on sale. That includes delivery, but there might be some VAT or sales tax on top of it. There's still quite a lot of room for some big tanks and vehicles in this one, as you can see. The more standard size one is the regular Mag Case. This one's £90 or $100 while on sale. This one's quite a lot taller, as demonstrated by that Chaos Knight hanging out on the ground floor. They all come with some magnets to mount to the bottoms of the bases of your miniatures. I'll leave the dimensions here on the screen. Then they have the really big one, the Mag Case XL, that has two of the previous attached together basically. Should be enough room for some entire collections there. There's a big Baneblade on the top left. And they do also have their terrain set as well. If you like some MDF terrain, it comes at a discount if paired with one of the Mag Cases. Check them out, link down in the video description though. A big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Their sale lasts until early December. I'll leave this one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. You can find that linked in the video description. Channel patrons get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.